On this special episode of Resi Week, we talked to Daryl Friedman, Ted Green, and Joe Whitaker about CEDIA elections. All this and more on this episode of Resi Week.
The network for the AV industry.
What are you listening to?
This
is AV.
This
is AVNation.
This is AVNation.
Welcome to this special episode of Resi Week. This is, as I said, a special episode wrapping up some fancy news and stories from the residential AV industry. I'm your host, Matty Scott for AVNation.tv, and this week I'm pleased to be joined by three of my longtime friends. First, we have Mr. Daryl Friedman. He is the CEO of CEDIA. How you doing, Daryl?
A little under the weather, but I'm hoping my voice is going to hold out for this podcast.
Then we have Mr. Ted Green. He's the founder of Strata-Gee.com. How you doing, Ted?
Doing great and happy to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. And last but not least, we have Mr. Joe Whitaker. He's the vice president of biz development at Origin Acoustics. How you doing, Joseph?
Very good. Glad to be dragged into what's going to be a fun-filled show.
You just had to say dragged in off the start. Come on. All right. What Joseph is alluding to is if you're in the Resi space and you're at all connected to CEDIA as an organization, you probably got an email last week from Mr. David Weinstein, the chairman of the board, outlining some changes to the board election process and what that slate is looking like. Subsequently, there was a bunch of the typical, we'll say, Facebook group postings and WhatsApp group things and all the other stuff that gets bounced around anytime literally anything happens at the association. And then, of course, Ted wrote a really good article outlining some of the concerns that people had as far as how these changes were enacted, how they were done. And then there was, of course, some questions about bylaws, which were obviously answered in the bottom of the article. Which I love the way you force people to read through the whole stinking thing. I like it.
It's my job.
I know. I'm applauding you. It was great. And then, of course, there was even more social stuff up until social stuff that I was reading literally right before this podcast. So we're going to get into a ton of that. We're going to talk to Ted about the article. We're going to talk to Daryl about what the association is doing and why. We're going to talk to Joe for generic feedback, and he's been in this forever. I might throw a sentence or two in. We'll see. But first of all, just before we get into that, I am going to call out one thing and one thing only for the time being. I love the discourse that this has caused. It's great to see people engage. It's great to see people talking about this. That's making me really happy. What frustrated me was a couple of people taking pot shots at the chairman, the vice chair, and Daryl for that matter, in a personal level, which isn't right. So if that was you, and you can read through the comments, you know who you are, don't stink and do that. A, it's unprofessional. B, it doesn't get us anywhere closer. And C, it kind of makes us disregard everything else you wrote. So you may have had a good point, but as soon as it turns into a personal attack, I know American politics is really big on that these days. We're big on that up here now too. See, I can add a comedy act into this as well. But don't do that. That takes away from the discourse and doesn't let us have a good conversation about what we're actually trying to talk about. So with that out of the way, and you can send your hate mail directly to me on that. That's perfectly fine. Daryl, I want to start with you on this. The email went out. I think it threw a lot of people off because they weren't expecting this. And in hindsight, in retrospect, I think you could have made the assumption that something was coming because typically that slate is announced before Expo comes up. Obviously, this is your first year going through this, being the new CEO, but typically we know that slate at CEDIA. There's a lot of glad handing and the normal things that happen in the typical format of board elections. that just didn't happen this year. But talk about, if you can, why we changed direction, where that stemmed from, and what it means for the future.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think, for me as the CEO of CEDIA, it's all about engagement, membership engagement. And let me say from the start, the members are very engaged in a lot of areas, and advocacy and workforce development, or committees, standards, education. But there's one area where our members have been historically disengaged, and that's the board elections. In the last election, 200 people cast votes. Now, this is a membership of almost 4,000 members today. So having 200 people determine who was on the board, it's just, it doesn't represent the will of the membership. So the board was looking for a different direction. Maybe there's a better way to do this. And they looked at inside and outside the organization to see kind of what else has been done. Outside the organization, many associations do a slate approach. And inside the organization, CEDIA itself had tried this slate approach, which resulted in many great board candidates. So just looking at that lack of engagement with 200 people voting, it didn't feel right to have those, we wanted to have a level playing field for all the nominations. Now, I just want to add, this was what I'm told was a record year for people submitting nominations for the board. And that's a good thing. People want to get involved with CEDIA again. We're excited about that. But to have a level playing field for these 24 people who were interested in being served, we couldn't just have 1/20th of the membership engaged in the voting. So they went with this approach, which is done fairly common. In my association experience, it's not uncommon to have a slate. So really, it's just about trying to get a different process because the process was not working.
I respect what you're saying as far as it's not right to have 200 people voting and electing members to the board, right? Now, granted, for all intents and purposes, that still isn't changing. If we still only have 200, 300 people voting for the slate, it's still 200 people approving those members, right? So when you say that the will of the organization as a whole isn't being served, to a degree, I feel like it is, because those members that are engaged are the ones that are voting. The members that are not engaged, that just pay their dues and just, that's maybe the only part they think about with CEDIA, they're not engaged. They don't care. So if it's like when you talk about general elections, and you guys have one coming up, so luckily I get all of your ads, so thank you for those. If you're not going to vote, if you're not going to participate in the process, then I don't care what your view on it is, because you didn't even take the time to vote. Am I wrong on this?
I see the point you're making, but when I've been around talking to members, I've talked to now hundreds, probably close to 1,000 members in the 11 months I've been on board. And every one of them has said that we need to figure out a way to create the next generation of leadership for CEDIA and to bring in new voices. And that's an important point that people have stressed to me. And if you only have 200 people doing that voting, you tend to have people voting for names that they know, people who are familiar. What the nominating committee, the governance committee essentially did was they took all of the candidates and they spent literally hundreds of people hours working on this, getting questionnaires, interviewing them, and really dedicating a lot of time to exploring all of the candidates, which frankly, those 200 people may not have done in that one moment when they're voting. So when they look at the total picture, spend that time, and Matt, you're on the governance committee, so you know how much time was put into this. They realized that there are 3 people who may never have been raised on the radar in the old system because they just weren't familiar names, but they were great names. And there were people who bring new ideas and new blood into this. So we think this is a process worth trying. It was tried before in 2016, and it resulted in some great candidates. And so it's just one more experiment that we're trying here to increase and evolve CEDIA.
I like it. Ted, you wrote a fantastic article on this, and without blowing smoke, it was one of the best articles I've seen you write about the organization in all the years I've been involved in the org. Is the major concern here, in your view, and all the people that you talked to in getting background for this, is the major concern with the change the fact that members felt that kind of the rug was pulled out from under them, right? All of a sudden it's a slate. They didn't know we were going to a slate. Respectfully, people that are engaged in the org are always very excited when there's any minor change to anything in the way that the org has been doing business. They will get online. They will write massive diatribes about literally nothing. You could change the color of the logo a touch and we'd have the same level of outrage. As Joe shakes his head for anyone who's not watching. Is this more an optics thing, a change thing, where people feel that a change happened and they weren't prepared well enough for it? Was it something more? Is it the same? And I know I'm kind of rambling here, but is it also kind of the same thing of like, hey, I've been nominated a couple of times and I haven't made it, and now I'm upset?
A lot to unpack there. First, I'd like to just to make sure I'm clear on everything. The host of this event is a current CEDIA director, former CEDIA director. Is that right?
I am a former board member. I currently sit on governance.
One of our guests is a current board member. Is that right? And CEO and global president.
I'm actually not a board member. I'm the CEO, but I'm not on the board. Matt's on the governance committee and a past board member.
And our other guest is a former CEDIA director. Is that correct? Yes. Feeling a little surrounded here, Matt.
Not at all.
Did everybody go through metal detectors before they entered the space? That's what I'm hoping.
We couldn't have 4 former board members on. That would be wrong.
Anyway, all joshing aside, let's get down to the question. First of all, let me just say that when the first source reached out to me to make me aware of this, I had not been aware of the election coming up. And, I guess I had noticed that there was, typically there's a lot of election discussion during the show. And I guess I had noticed that hadn't taken place. There were a lot of things different at this year's show, which was a great show, by the way, but there were a lot of things that were different. Then I heard from another source, and then I started asking around, and I'm not sure Daryl and the board would see it this way, but actually, I'm a little surprised that people cared this much to be upset about it. And I see your point, Matt, on personalizing it. I think we can keep this discussion to the issues and not necessarily the people. But I think that this is one of those scenarios where almost I can see where both sides are correct. In other words, I don't think anybody intentionally did anything untoward. But I do think you touched on something, Matt, that I think is very true, which is there are a lot of members that don't pay a lot of attention to what CEDIA is doing and don't volunteer as much as they should and don't engage as much as they should. But if there's one thing that that a lot of them look for, it is the board elections. And even if they don't vote, they're confident there are people on there that are going to get elected that they feel comfortable with. I think the issue that what happened this year was the fact that there was a change. The change wasn't announced until it was a fait accompli. And that surprised people. And I think the feeling that there's 3 open seats and you're telling us that there's 3 candidates to vote for feels a little bit not like a fair process where I get to choose who I think are the best people. I had people say things to me like, well, do you know if they'll let me write people in? And I'm like, yeah, I don't think so. It's a slate. So Daryl's right that offering a slate of directors is not uncommon in the association world. I'll take his judgment. He had said that about 50%, I think he said this on the podcast, Daryl, about 50% of associations use the slate approach. But in fact, CEDIA never used it except for one example. And that one example only happened in the wake of subsuming UK, CEDIA UK. And, they needed to put together the board, adding in the UK people. And so it wasn't a surprise that year it was a little bit of a different process. All the other years, for all the other decades, there's always been this defined process, and that process was that you had multiple candidates, that you've reviewed their profiles and you chose who you felt would be a good candidate. And if you knew somebody that was a candidate and you knew they would be good, you'd be excited about that. And it would be sort of a form of engagement. I feel like what has people, there's multiple things. I've talked to probably dozens of people, and everybody has kind of their take on it that they didn't like about it. But for those that didn't like it, but I think that part of it was that it was a surprise, and it was an after the fact surprise. Not that we're going to do it this way, but we've done it this way. So go ahead and either give it a thumbs up or thumbs down. Didn't feel like you had much of a choice. And I think, more than anything, it's a new administration now, and people are kind of watching what's going on. And I mentioned in my article that the issue that the head of the governance committee raised, which was the issue of engagement, it's a challenge for the association. It has been. In fact, Matt, I remember you and I talking about it when you first ran to be a director, the lack of engagement and what can we do. I'm not sure this was a good choice for a thing to do. I think this was something that was chosen probably for expediency's sake, or for perceived best course sake, without any consultation, but not necessarily one that's going to make members feel like, hey, I'm being considered. They asked my opinion. I think that I think that the governance committee and the board sort of stumbled into, accidentally, if you will, maybe, giving everybody the benefit of the doubt, accidentally stumbled into an age-old problem that upsets members with the board, which is that they really don't listen to us and they really don't ask our opinion. And, as one of the commenters on my website raised the issue, which is, if you're upset about 200 people, picking the next board of directors for 3,000 or 4,000 members, well, then why does it make sense for 6 people to pick the board members for 3,000 members or 4,000 members to deal with? It felt like a mixed message.
So the governance committee is made up of a minority of board members, one past board member, including Matt, and then fresh voices who have never been on the board, like James Chen of Chords, Kalia Bendor of Walsmart, et cetera. And that's designed to bring in fresh voices. Now, Ted mentioned that about listening to the membership. I think I've been listening to the membership for quite some time since I started. I've traveled the world. I have an open email address. My phone number is public. I've heard from, I would say now, hundreds, maybe even close to 1,000 members. And what they're telling me is they want fresh thinking and they want fresh voices on the board. Now, what's not been discussed on this podcast is James, Jen, and Stefan, the 3 candidates who've been slated, who were not known by the governance committee. This was not anybody that they knew previously, but they researched them, interviewed them by panel, and they came up with, these are people who can bring fresh ideas and fresh perspectives to the board. I don't believe they would have been elected under the old process, because there was sort of a, go vote for people who were familiar to you. So I think we are listening to it. And the reason that those, 8 to 12 people were making those calls as opposed to the 200, to Ted's point, is because they literally spent hundreds of hours researching every one of the candidates, talking to every one of the candidates, which is essentially is just impractical and impossible for the membership to do. So we presented this slate, as is very common, and we think that these 3 candidates, I hope we can talk about their qualifications, we think these 3 candidates are going to be great additions to the board.
All that is true, and given all that, but that doesn't make the member feel like their voice was heard. That makes them feel like you made the choice for me. And I mentioned that in my article. It felt very paternalistic. You're not engaged, so we'll make the decision for you. And that just rubbed a lot of people the wrong way.
Yeah, I understood, Ted. And of course, and your article was great, because I think people came to you initially with an accusation about bylaws, which you dispelled. You said the key point in your article was the dissenters got it wrong, and we were certainly in accord with our bylaws. But I do want to remind you that every one of these candidates were submitted by the membership, and the membership has ultimate authority to ratify or not ratify the slate.
My advice would be to review the election process and the bylaws, make some thoughts about a fair method to do that. Instead of pursuing a procedure that makes the members feel like because you're not engaged, we'll do the work for you. It may be true. I certainly take your word for it, but it doesn't play well to the members. And instead, we need to find ways to get more member engagement. And this has been one of the perennial issues with members is the board would be making all kinds of decisions, selling the show, investing millions of dollars in a new building, none of which anybody ever asked members what they felt about that. And while some members, I'm sure, are fine with that, I think, that's why I said you sort of unwittingly walked into the same perception, right? And perception is reality of what people have been unhappy about with the association for a few years now.
So I want to preface or put an addendum on this for 1 second. Our closest industry partner is Avixa. They run the Infocom show. They're partners in ISC. They run a slate. They've run a slate for years. Now, I play my company, we play in both spaces fairly equally. The connection and the engagement that the engaged members have with CEDIA is incredibly higher than it is on the Avixa side. The Avixa members, while they may be engaged, it's not as personal or never seems to be as personal as it is for a lot of the CEDIA members when CEDIA makes a change. So I find that very interesting from a slate side, whereas they've been doing it for years, and I have not heard anything from anyone I've talked to on the Avixa side who really has a major issue with it. There's some people who are like, yeah, whatever. I'd be happy to vote for an individual, but yeah, whatever. The CEDIA side, the members that are engaged are significantly higher or engaged to a much greater level. Joe, let me bring you in on this, because the word that keeps coming up and the thing that we keep tiptoeing around or wading through very quickly, splashing all over the place, is engagement. And when you and I were on the board, when I was leading into trying to get elected to get on the board, et cetera, engagement was a big thing. And I don't know how you take a member that pays their dues, shows up, listens to something, maybe takes a training here or there, goes to the show, and that's their level of engagement, versus the ones who will write articles longer than Ted's on Facebook about, again, something that they seem to take very deeply, which again is great, but it's like having super fans and having the casual fan who won't even buy the baseball cap, right? As an org, as somebody who's been on, almost every committee and seen the gamut of all aspects of this, how can we increase engagement so that basically we just have more people engaged, but so that if we want to see change or if we want to see something happen, we have the engagement, we have the membership involved enough to articulate that and not just have the same 20 people ranting online.
So to preface this, I want to say that a lot of those decisions that Ted was just alluding to, which some may have been popular, some may have not. I've been involved in almost all of them, from the CEDIA rebrand to global alignment to the sale of the show. So this is I never got to tell Daryl this, but the seat that the decision makers are on today, I've sat in that exact same seat. I have, as a board member, as a governance committee member, have within our groups voted yes for some things that were deemed unpopular at the time. So I've been in this exact position. Now I just happen to sit on the other side of the table, which makes it kind of interesting. But the thought for engagement is interesting. Because Daryl had mentioned the 2016 slate, which was a byproduct. I was on the governance committee at the time of the fact that we were going to have to combine two boards for a transitional period. So we were in a transitional period. We had no way to hold a global election yet. We had no mechanism for it. We had no member counts. We hadn't even really, combined the members as a whole. That was a whole separate thing back then. So that was unpopular, but the reasoning was there, the why. Like we had to do that to push things forward. The engagement portion, though, Matt, to get back to what you were saying, is very interesting to me in that those discussions have happened before. And there's been a lot of cart before the horse concepts in the past that were either talked about or even considered up for, a board vote. But the engagement portion, when you say, the last time there was a vote, there were only 200 voters. Okay, I totally find that to be factual. I can go back to those years and say those things. But when you want to engage our members, remember, it's an association of, by the members, for the members, is the fact that you have to put the people there that will get engagement. A perfect example was Peter Aylett. Peter Aylett currently, I think, still holds the record for most votes with 146 votes just for him. And keep in mind that year there were 12 nominees, I believe. So, the engagement is there when there's the members put forth to get those votes. Yeah, I can remember years and years back where we were probably around 500. It was a really big slate year. I mean, a really big nominee year, by the way, of a bunch of people knew. There was Haggai, there was Murray, there was a lot of people. So, I mean, the engagement can be there. But, I go back to the, if you want engagement, the nominees should be people that have engaged with our members before. My only pushback really in all this all came down to the choice. And obviously, having been there since global alignment, I understand the need for those regional seats. You kind of have to do that. It was kind of written in the agreement. We have to represent, the entire globe now. But when you break the slate itself down into that regional thing, what happens in the UK usually doesn't affect the members in the US, right? Because we don't have the same kind of governance, the same kind of policies, the same kind of restrictions and certifications. But the regional set of the slate, where as a US member, I look at it, there's only one US person and a UK member. Now, although all these people are massively respectful, I mean, you can look through their bios, they're great people. Hands down, yes, they should be on a nominee list. I cannot take that away from them. The experience of some of the volunteerism, I mean, there's a lot there. But, it's that whole, what Ted was getting to on, that freedom of choice. And how do you build that engagement? You build that engagement with those discussions and with the research of the nominees and with looking at, just like you were talking about, Matt, we have some U.S. elections coming up, is which one of those people best represents me, the functionality of my business. One of the people maybe, have 25 employees and operate in 30 states. And a guy that has, the typical 80% of CEDIA membership, less than 5 guys, under 2 million a year, they're going to go, yeah, that person doesn't represent the functionality of my business. The things that they're going to sit at the table and talk about will have zero effect, positively or negatively, on my business. They can't relate or represent me. That's where the problem comes from. And that's where the engagement can get stronger eventually, is looking at the core components of what our membership is, how the membership makeup is, and then putting forth nominees based on the actual makeup of our industry. Those are all functions that I know have been looked at before. I know they've been talked about, but that was my kind of one of my only personal pushbacks on it was, I just didn't feel the representation there anymore. Now, it did create engagement, so I'll give everybody that. It created engagement. Not all of it was
Success.
good, but it did create some engagement. But it's one of those things that we'll see, when the vote goes through. We don't know what it'll look like one way or another, how that'll turn out. Only time will tell. But I know, Daryl said publicly that they are going to continually look at this process. And I can appreciate that, change for the sake of change is never good, right? But change when you're looking for an outcome, a strategic outcome on the other side, can be very beneficial. We're just not there yet to know if it works or not.
And can I say something just about engagement in general? Because I don't want to sell the CEDIA membership short here. The CEDIA members are incredibly engaged. This is one area, but it's not the total picture. Ted just wrote an article last week about CEDIA Expo, and I think one of the subheadlines was the CEDIA membership engaged? Absolutely. 300 people coming to a 7:30 meeting to learn about advocacy. I was just in London on Friday, 400 people in a room raising their hand to say that they will go into schools and do outreach to bring people into this industry. This membership is incredibly engaged. It's only this one little aspect of it that the board elections is one that has low turnout. But please don't paint the CEDIA membership as disengaged, because this is I've worked in nonprofits and associations my whole career. This is one of the most actively engaged and passionate industries I've ever worked with.
Daryl, let's wrap this up across the board. One of the things that I did want you to touch on for a second, if you can, was something that, I heard it when I was on the board, that how dare you people, make a decision without consulting the membership. And I think I'd been on the board for like 3 months, and I was out doing a press event at one of the buying groups out in Dallas, I think. And I'm sitting down having lunch with a group of integrators who I knew no one. And the organizers would not print me a badge, even though I was there for AVNation doing press. They refused to print me a badge that did not say CEDIA Board of Directors. Now, I wasn't there in that capacity, which is why I didn't want that on my badge. You sit down with that badge, you hear it very quickly. Been on for 3 months, and gosh, all of them unloaded on me. These are all, or at the time, there were a bunch of dealers out of Southern California, and man, did they have some opinions. On and on and on about how they weren't consulted on this and they weren't consulted on that, and they were upset about this and they were upset about that, to the point where I kind of looked at everybody and said, all right, okay, sure. Like, make me a list. That's fine. I'll take it back and we can talk about it some more, but make me a list. At some point, and again, at the time I was on the board, we as the board have to make some decisions. And I mean this with all due respect, we cannot consult people on every single decision we make. I've been a business owner for 20 years. I do not ask my, first year apprentices what they think we should be doing corporately from supply chain situations. It just, like, sometimes decisions have to be made. The complaint I always hear, with really any organization, but specifically with CEDIA, because we're talking about CEDIA, is that they don't ask us enough. They don't ask for our input enough. I know that the staff will send out not massive, but a large number of questionnaires or responses for comment, and get, at times, not a lot of response. At some point, we have to just continue to move forward. And we can't ask for opinions on everything. How do you balance that?
It's a great question. And of course, and I know you're Canadian, but as in all of our governments, whether north or south, we have representational democracy. So sometimes we have to make in the U.S. we have each member of Congress represents 700,000 people, has to make decisions in real time, can't always consult 700,000 people. In nonprofit organizations, you have a board that can make decisions on behalf of its membership, but we have to listen to the membership. So I think we know what I've done. Someone said to me at Expo, your accessibility is legendary. I hope that's true, but I've made my email and phone number public. I get all sorts of incoming from members. We've taken a lot of those inputs, and I've taken a lot of that advice and implemented that. We also have done a lot of research, not just with members, but with non-members. You don't understand why someone doesn't join an association by doing a member survey. You survey the non-members. So we've done some focus groups, non-members, to see what is missing, what offerings do we need to do. So there's a lot of listening. This board is very intent on listening to the membership. I think you saw some of the board members involved in this decision being very reticent, going back to the membership and trying to explain their positions and even apologizing for ways things were worded that may have been hurtful. So it's all about listening. It's all about two-way communication. I always say this, but if you'll allow me, ceo@cedia.org is the email address. I read every single email. I answer everyone. We actually did a voting email on the ballot, so and I answered every one of those emails as well. So it's about having a board to be able to act in real time and make decisions. But of course, it's about listening to the membership, and I hope we'll continue to do that effectively.
And I want to respond to your question directly. I don't think that members are asking to be engaged on every single decision the board makes. I think they understand.
I'm going to send you some of the emails I've gotten.
Look, I've become kind of the CEDIA complaint department, so I'm hearing it all the time. And I think they feel like they're getting, typically what happens is the board comes up to, is looking at something, looking at a decision. Each individual board member calls 3 or 4 people they know, and they ask their opinion. My recommendation to the association is to every once in a while, on a fairly regular basis, maybe once a month, pick 2 or 3 things, put it out there for a non-binding referral vote, if you will, ratification vote, non-binding. But on anything that's reasonably significant, just to get a broader feedback rather than just your personal network that each of the board members have. I've often said to people, no, they do talk to members, but board members tend to just call 2 or 3 people they know that are maybe thoughtful that they can get some perspective from. The membership does feel disengaged, and they feel like most of the members that I talk to, and I don't talk to all of them, obviously, but I talked to quite a few over the course of a year, and they feel like they don't care what I think anyway. They're just going to do what they want to do. They shouldn't have that feeling. If you can say, well, look, how many of the surveys we sent out have you responded to? You can kind of put it back on them. But right now, they feel disengaged. They feel like you don't care what they think, and you're going to do what you want to do without their thought. And so if you're going to change the rules and how we do our election process, I don't think that anybody is saying you can't do that. I think it's like everything. It's not only what you do, but how you do it. So put it out there for a ratification vote. We're thinking about changing. We're thinking about going to a slate process. That will make it easier for you. You won't have to review a dozen candidates and, try to decide on your own and whatever it is, whatever the reasoning or whatever the thinking behind it is. I mean, in my article, I quoted word for word what Jamie Briesmeister said, which that she was elected under the old system. But now it was time for her to conduct election, and she realized that the bylaws and the charter were very confusing and blah, 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 whatever it was, and made it difficult. Well, if that's true, then change the bylaws and change the charter and then communicate to the membership you're going to do that and let them have a say in it. Again, not every operational decision the board's involved in, but as much as possible, every so often, a ratification vote will help them feel more engaged. I feel, and I think I said this to you, Daryl, I don't remember if I did or not. I feel part of the reason for the lack of engagement, and I'm hearing it a lot on this issue that's come up, is there's a lack of trust. I think if we built more trust from the membership into the association and that they are really, truly looking out for the membership and overt ways that they're doing that, looking out for the membership, will build trust. And then if you build trust, that will build engagement. That's my 2 cents worth.
I think Ted said something very important, which is that he's become the CEDIA complaint department. So when you do that, you understand that you're going to be getting one side of the story. No one's going to call you to say, I think the slate is great. But we have gotten a lot of emails and people calling us saying, this is a good idea. These people are phenomenal. Even one of the commenters on your post at the end said, wow, this slate I've been a member 25 years. The slate is great. I believe in this process. So understand there are a lot of members who like this approach. There are a lot of members who are voting for it. And so we don't, I understand when people go to a certain place to air their complaints, that's not necessarily broadening. That's not necessarily the position of the entire membership. What I would say to the listeners and viewers of this is go to cedia.net/vote, look at those 3 candidates, James Ratcliffe, Jen Mallett, and Stefan Goodview. If you will not find anything wrong with those candidates. They're exceptional people. I encourage you, I'm not going to tell you how to vote, but I encourage you to vote. We want to make sure there's good participation and CEDIA membership is engaged like they are with everything else in this process.
And one of the things is you look at it in a typical marketing fashion is that it only takes one bad review to destroy 100 good ones, right? Like that's your typical makes sense. All you got to do is have one complainer, and all of a sudden 100 attaboys no longer count. But on the one of the things you said, Daryl, that to me is always unique. You said, our members are engaging. Our industry is engaging. Not necessarily our members. It's our industry as a whole. When you look at, there was almost 12,000 people in attendance at Expo, but there's technically right around only 3,000 member companies globally. So if you look at it, our industry as a whole is very engaging. There are a lot of people that are not members. I think they should be, but that's my personal opinion. But there are a lot out there, and they're all engaging. There's people that are, as a matter of fact, not even members that volunteer for CEDIA. So you have all of those kind of things involved in that, the overall look at the industry. So yeah, they are very engaging. I wish members would be a little more engaging on certain things. I was glad, Daryl, that you brought up the legislative breakfast. That was like one of the most well-attended, double sold out morning events that have ever happened in Expo history. So, I mean, the engagement is there. It's just getting people to pay attention to some other stuff too.
It's like anything. There's always room for improvement. All right, let's leave it there. Let's wrap it up. Thank you all for joining us today. Ted, if people want to connect with you, learn more about Strata-Gee.com, where can they do that?
That's the best place, Strata-Gee.com, STRATA-GEE.com.
Excellent. Mr. Whitaker, if people want to connect with you, learn more about Origin Acoustics, where can they do that?
Oh, they can always find me on whatever socials at Joe Whitaker, or I always, nobody ever does this, give out my email just like Daryl did, joe@originacoustics.com. And you can hopefully, find me on continual stuff with Matt Scott.
I continually give that to every sign up I see online. Daryl, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time for this. If people want to connect with you, learn more about CEDIA, if they want to go and vote and ratify the slate or not ratify the slate, however you want to go, where do they do that?
CEDIA.net is our website. CEDIA.net/vote is the voting site. Give me a call, 317-912-1297. I like talking to members. I love hearing from members. I learn a lot from all of you. This is how we listen. This is how we learn. This is how we do better.
I am going to applaud you for that again. I think I did it the last time you were on. I own a business and I don't want to give out my phone number or my personal email. But yet you are incredibly accessible, which is, that in itself is such a massive change within the org. I love to see it after all my years of being involved. But thanks again for joining us. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to connect with me and send me the aforementioned hate mail, you can do that on Twitter at Matt D. Scott, because that way everybody else gets to see it too, and most other social platforms. But more importantly, please visit AVNation.tv, where you'll find this show as well as a wide variety of other shows with all the verticals that we cover. When you visit the website, please take a moment to check out our supporters. We are extremely thankful for their support and ask that you check them out as well. Thanks again for watching. That's all the time we have for this episode of Resi Week.